You are not tired because you don't have enough energy. You are tired because you are leaking the energy you already have, drop by drop, all day long, without ever noticing the wound. By the end of this video, you will know exactly where that leak is and how a 400-year-old swordsman who never lost a single duel accidentally solved the exhaustion crisis of the 21st century. Picture this: a man walks into a fight holding a wooden sword against a man holding steel, and he wins not because he's stronger, but because his opponent has already spent his energy before the blade even moves. That's you most days. And later, I'm going to show you why the thing you're doing right now to fight your tiredness, the coffee, the motivation videos, the forcing, is actually the exact thing making it worse. But first, type the word leak in the comments if you already know you're bleeding energy somewhere you haven't looked yet. You wake up and you're already behind. Not because you slept badly necessarily, sometimes you slept fine, and that's the part that scares you. You open your eyes and the tiredness is already sitting on your chest like it got there before you did. You reach for your phone before your feet touch the floor, and in the first 4 minutes of consciousness you've absorbed a news headline, 3 messages you haven't answered, a photo of someone else's vacation, and a vague, low-grade dread about a meeting you haven't prepared for. None of it is a crisis. All of it costs something. By 9 a.m. you've made 40 small decisions: what to wear, what to eat, which email to answer first, whether to respond to that one text that's been sitting there for 2 days, making you feel slightly guilty every time you see it. By lunch, you're running on the mental equivalent of fumes, and you haven't done anything anyone would call hard work yet. You get home and you have nothing left for the people who actually matter to you. Your kid asks you a question and you answer in monosyllables. Your partner says you seem distant, and you don't even have the energy to explain that you're not distant, you're just empty. This is the real cost. Not just fatigue, the slow erosion of your patience, your presence, your ability to actually show up as yourself instead of a depleted, irritable shadow of yourself. You start to wonder if something is wrong with you. It isn't. You're just spending energy on things that were never supposed to cost anything. Maybe you've already tried the obvious fixes. You've gone to bed earlier for a week and felt marginally better, then slipped right back. You've cut caffeine, then reintroduced it out of desperation by Thursday. You've downloaded the app that tracks your sleep score and stared at the number every morning like it was a verdict on your character. None of it addressed the actual problem, because none of it was ever about sleep quantity in the first place. Plenty of people sleep 8 full hours and still wake up feeling like they never stop working. The tiredness you're describing isn't a rest deficit, it's a leverage problem. You're spending energy in 100 small places that don't build anything, don't move anything forward, and don't even feel like choices anymore because you've been making them on autopilot for years. Think about the weekends too, because this isn't only a weekday problem. You get to Saturday morning telling yourself this is the day you'll finally feel like yourself again, and somehow by 2 in the afternoon you're just as flat as you were on Wednesday, except now you also feel guilty about it, because you had the time and you still couldn't shake the fog. You scroll instead of resting. You tell yourself you're recharging, but recharging usually means absorbing someone else's highlight reel, someone else's opinion, someone else's outrage, and somehow you finish the scroll more tired than when you started, not less. That's the part that should tell you something. Real rest restores you. Whatever you've been calling rest for the last few years mostly hasn't been. And when Sunday night arrives and the dread of Monday creeps in before Monday has even happened, you're not lazy and you're not broken. You're a person whose energy has been quietly siphoned off in 100 directions you were never taught to notice, let alone guard. Marcus Aurelius, a Roman emperor who ran an empire while writing private notes to himself at night, kept coming back to one idea. Most of what disturbs us isn't the event itself, but the enormous amount of energy we pour into resisting it, resenting it, or replaying it. He wasn't talking about laziness, he was pointing at something almost invisible, that the exhausting part of a hard day usually isn't the day, it's everything your mind does on top of the day. And that reframe is where we start. Seneca made almost the same point to a friend of his named Lucilius in a letter about the shortness of life. He wasn't arguing that people die too young. He was arguing that people spend the life they do have so carelessly on grudges, on distractions, on other people's demands, that by the time they reach the end of it, they've barely lived any of it. On their own terms, even though the total number of years might have been perfectly sufficient. Life isn't short, he said, in effect. We make it short. And the same is true of a single day's energy. 24 hours is usually enough. It only feels insufficient because so much of it gets spent on friction instead of living. Here is the core idea, and I want you to hold on to it because everything else in this video builds on it. You don't have an energy problem. You have a leak problem. Your body, under almost all normal circumstances, generates more than enough energy to do what actually matters to you. What drains you isn't the doing, it's the friction, the unmade decisions, the unresolved conflicts, the divided attention, the performances you put on for people who aren't even watching, the imaginary futures you rehearse 100 times before they happen, if they happen at all. This is not a productivity hack. It's not about doing more, moving faster, optimizing your morning routine into a military operation, or finding the one weird trick that gives you superhuman stamina. It doesn't mean you should feel guilty for resting, and it doesn't mean tiredness is always your fault. Sometimes it's biological, sometimes it's grief, sometimes it's a body that needs a doctor, not a mindset shift. What it means is narrower and more useful than that. A huge percentage of the fatigue you feel on an average day isn't coming from your responsibilities. It's coming from how you're carrying them. Think of it like a bucket with several small cracks instead of one big one. Pour water into a bucket with a single obvious hole, and you can see the problem immediately. You plug the hole, the water stays. But pour water into a bucket with 5 hairline cracks scattered across the bottom, each one leaking so slowly you can barely see it happening, and you'll spend months convinced the bucket itself is simply too small, when the truth is the bucket was always the right size. Nobody taught you to look for hairline cracks. You were taught to look for holes, dramatic, obvious problems with dramatic, obvious solutions. Burnout, depression, a diagnosis, a villain, something to point at. Sometimes that's exactly what's happening. And if it is, this video isn't a substitute for real support. Talk to someone. But for a very large number of people watching this right now, there's no single hole. There are 5 small cracks, and they've been open so long you've stopped noticing the sound of the water going out. And that puts you in a strange position, because modern life rewards the opposite of what actually restores you. It rewards busyness as a badge of honor. It rewards being on constantly, responsive, available, performing competence every hour you're awake. It treats rest as something you earn only after you've proven you're exhausted enough to deserve it. The old idea, the one this video is built around, says something almost rebellious by comparison. That the most powerful people in history weren't the ones who did the most. They were the ones who wasted the least. There was a swordsman in 17th century Japan named Miyamoto Musashi, and by the time he wrote down what he'd learned, he had survived more than 60 duels without a single loss. What's strange about the way he describes those fights isn't the technique, it's the economy. He talks about striking once with total commitment instead of striking 5 times out of hesitation. He talks about opponents who lost not because they were weaker, but because they'd already exhausted themselves, tensing, second-guessing, adjusting their stance over and over, burning through their nerve before the real moment even arrived. The winning move in his account usually belonged to whoever had spent the least energy getting to the moment that mattered. That's the method this video is named for, and you'll see exactly how it applies to your Tuesday morning, not just a battlefield. There's a detail in Musashi's writing that most people skip past, and it's the one that matters most here. He wasn't naturally calm. He describes years of trial and error, losses of composure, close calls before he ever fought clean. The economy of motion came later, built through repetition, not talent he was simply born with. That matters, because it means what you're about to learn isn't a personality trait some people have and others don't. It's a set of habits, which means it's learnable starting today by the tired, ordinary version of you reading this right now, not by some idealized, disciplined future version of you who never actually shows up. Let's start with the leak that costs you the least per instance and the most in total volume, because it happens dozens of times a day and you've stopped noticing it entirely. The decision tax. Think about the last time you stood in front of your closet for 4 minutes deciding what to wear to something that genuinely didn't matter. Or scrolled a delivery app for 10 minutes trying to choose between 3 restaurants you've ordered from 100 times before. Or sat with your cursor blinking over an email, rewriting the same sentence 5 different ways, not because the stakes were high, but because you couldn't decide which version sounded right. None of these decisions are hard. That's exactly the problem. Your mind treats each one like a tiny negotiation. And negotiations cost energy, whether the price is a promotion or a lunch order. Seneca wrote to a friend once about people who were, in his words, busy with nothing, constantly occupied, constantly choosing, constantly adjusting, and somehow arriving at the end of the day having produced almost nothing of value. He wasn't describing laziness, he was describing exactly this motion, without direction, choice without weight. There's a well-documented pattern in psychology called decision fatigue. The quality and ease of your decision-making degrades the more choices you make in a row, regardless of how small each one is. Your brain doesn't distinguish between which shirt and which job offer the way you'd think. It just registers another draw on the same account. Here's the reframe. You are not indecisive because you're weak-willed. You're indecisive because you've been treating every choice, no matter how small, as if it deserves full deliberation, and nobody has that much energy to spend. The action for today is almost embarrassingly simple. Pick 3 recurring low-stakes decisions in your life: what you eat for breakfast, what you wear on ordinary days, which route you take to work, and make the decision once, permanently, so it never costs you again. That's not boring. That's a sword that only needs to cut once. You might be thinking that this sounds small, almost too small to matter. That's exactly why it works, and exactly why almost nobody does it. We're drawn to the dramatic fix, the retreat, the detox, the total life overhaul because it feels like it matches the size of how tired we feel. But the leak was never one big wound. It was 40 tiny ones, and 40 tiny ones don't get patched by one grand gesture. They get patched by 40 tiny decisions, made once and then left alone. Let me ask you something before we go further, because this next one is heavier than the last. What's the conversation you keep having in your head with someone who isn't even in the room? You know the one. Maybe it's the coworker who took credit for your idea. Maybe it's the family member who said something at dinner 8 months ago that you still haven't fully let go of. You're not actively thinking about it every minute, but it's there in the background like a browser tab you never closed, quietly using processing power you assumed was free. This is the grudge weight, and it might be the single most underestimated energy leak most people carry. Every time that memory resurfaces in the shower, on your commute, right before you fall asleep, your body responds as if the conflict is happening again right now. Your heart rate shifts slightly, your jaw tightens, you rehearse the comeback you never said, and then the moment passes and you go back to your day, but something's been spent. Epictetus, who had been enslaved before eventually teaching philosophy as a free man, built almost his entire framework around one distinction. Some things are within your control and some things are not, and the exhausting mistake most people make is spending their energy trying to control, refight, or re-narrate things that are already finished. He wasn't telling people to become passive or to let themselves be mistreated. He was pointing out that relitigating a closed event in your mind is a fight you can never actually win because there's no opponent there anymore, just you spending real energy on an imaginary rematch. Psychologists have a name for part of what's happening here: the Zeigarnik effect. The well-documented tendency for unfinished or unresolved situations to stay mentally open and intrusive, replaying themselves far more than resolved ones do, simply because your mind treats them as incomplete business. Here's the reframe, and I want you to actually sit with this one. You are not weak for still thinking about it. Your mind is doing exactly what minds do with unfinished business. It's just that most people never learn how to actually close the file instead of endlessly reopening it. The action today is this: pick one grudge you're currently carrying and either send a message that actually resolves it or make a deliberate conscious decision to file it as closed, not forgiven necessarily, not forgotten, just closed, no longer available for replay. You'll notice the weight difference within a day. Notice something else about this leak, because it's easy to miss. The size of the original event and the size of the ongoing cost usually don't match. A comment that took someone 5 seconds to say can occupy 5 months of your background processing if you let it. That's not because you're overly sensitive, it's because your mind treats unresolved as a category, not a severity level. A 5-second slide and a 5-year betrayal can both sit open in the same folder, quietly running, until you make the decision to close the file yourself. Nobody else is going to close it for you, the other person has probably already forgotten it happened. There's also a version of this leak that isn't about other people at all, it's the grudge you're carrying against yourself. The mistake from 2 years ago that still shows up uninvited when you're trying to fall asleep. The version of you that said the wrong thing, missed the opportunity, chose badly, and never quite got filed away as finished. You'd never let a friend carry that same weight indefinitely without eventually telling them to let it go. But you'll carry your own version of it for years without ever applying the same standard to yourself. Epictetus would have called this exactly what it is. Spending your limited store of energy trying to renegotiate the past, which is the one thing in the entire universe that is permanently, completely outside your control. Here's the counterintuitive part, and it's going to sound backwards at first. You'd think the fix for low energy is more stimulation, more caffeine, more motivational content, more hype, more pressure to power through. But every single leak we've covered so far gets worse under stimulation, not better. Caffeine doesn't close the browser tab of your unresolved grudge, it just makes you jittery while the tab stays open. A louder motivational video doesn't automate the 40 small decisions ambushing your morning, it just adds one more voice shouting at you to try harder at carrying a weight you never needed to carry in the first place. If you've made it this far, you're already thinking about your own energy differently than almost everyone scrolling past this video right now. Most people bail before the part where the video actually asks something of them. And you didn't. So do one thing before we go further. Hit like on this video right now, not because I'm asking nicely, but because it's the fastest way to make sure the next section, the one where I show you exactly why trying harder to have more energy backfires, actually reaches you when it goes up. That backfire I promised you at the very start, we're 2 sections away from it. Keep going. The third leak is quieter than the first 2, and it's the one most people would never think to call exhausting, because it looks like the opposite of tired, it looks like competence. This is the performance drain. The energy you spend not doing the work, but managing how the work and you appear to other people. Think about the last meeting where you had a decent idea, but you rehearsed how you'd phrase it 3 separate times before speaking, worried it might sound obvious or wrong. Think about the text you wrote and deleted and rewrote because you wanted to seem casual without seeming like you were trying to seem casual. Think about walking into a room a few minutes late and spending the next 20 minutes not focused on the actual meeting, but on whether everyone noticed what they thought, whether it mattered. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself repeatedly as a kind of reminder he apparently needed often that other people's opinions of him were not his responsibility to manage, and that most of the energy spent worrying about being seen a certain way was energy stolen from actually living. There's a well-known psychological finding behind why this feels so consuming: the spotlight effect. Our tendency to dramatically overestimate how much other people notice and remember about us. Studies on this go back decades. People consistently believe their mistakes, their outfit, their awkward pause are far more memorable to others than they actually are, because everyone else is equally busy running their own internal spotlight on themselves. Here's the reframe. You are not vain or shallow for caring how you come across. You're human, and you live around other humans. But the amount of processing power you're spending managing a spotlight that barely exists is a leak, not a personality trait, and it's fixable. The action for today is small but sharp. The next time you catch yourself rehearsing how something will look, ask one question: will I remember this in a week? If the honest answer is no, let yourself say it plainly and move on without the performance layer. Here's what makes this leak sneaky compared to the first 2. It disguises itself as diligence. Rehearsing a sentence 3 times before saying it out loud feels like care, like professionalism, like taking the moment seriously. Sometimes it is, but most of the time, past the first rehearsal, you're no longer improving the sentence, you're just managing anxiety about how it'll land and calling that preparation. The tell is simple. If the second and third rehearsals aren't meaningfully better than the first, you weren't refining anymore. You are performing for an audience that, per the research on the spotlight effect, was barely paying attention in the first place. The forced leak is the one costing you the most per hour, even though it feels the least dramatic in the moment. Divided attention. You're on a call, but you're also half reading a Slack message. You're having dinner with someone you love, but your phone is face up on the table and some part of your brain is holding a slot open for it, waiting. You tell yourself this is efficient, that you're getting more done by doing two things at once, but there's a real cost here that has nothing to do with how focused you feel and everything to do with what happens after you switch away from a task. Psychologists call this attentional residue. When you shift your attention from one task to another, a portion of your focus stays stuck on the first task, so you're never actually giving 100% to the second one, even if it feels like you are. You're not multitasking. You're rapidly switching between two half-finished things and paying a small energy tax on every single switch all day, every day. Seneca described people who scattered themselves across too many places, too many pursuits, too many half-attentions, and observed that they ended their lives having been everywhere and nowhere, having touched everything and finished nothing. Here's the pattern interrupt worth sitting with for a second. What if the reason you're restful scrolling doesn't actually feel restful is that it's not rest at all, it's just another open task your attention never gets to fully close? Here's the reframe. You're not bad at focusing. You're operating in an environment engineered to fracture your attention every few minutes, and the tiredness you feel by evening isn't from working too hard, it's from switching too often. The action today: pick one block of time, even just 25 minutes, and give it exactly one task. Phone in another room, one tab open. Notice how different tired feels at the end of that block compared to 25 minutes of switching. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it explains something that probably confuses you. Why a genuinely demanding day of focused work can leave you feeling more alive than a lazy afternoon of half watching something while half scrolling something else. Depth doesn't drain you the way fragmentation does. A single sword strike, committed fully, costs less than 5 hesitant ones, even though the single strike looks, from the outside, like it required more. It didn't require more. It just required all of you in one place at one time instead of a little of you scattered across 4. Now here's the sharpest one, the one most people never think to name as a leak at all, because it doesn't look like waste, it looks like preparation, responsibility, even love. This is the leak of living your bad outcomes before they happen. You have a hard conversation scheduled for Thursday and it's only Monday, but you've already had that conversation in your head 14 times, in 14 slightly different versions, and in most of them it goes badly. You have a health scare that turned out to be nothing, but for the 4 days before the test results came back, you lived through a version of your life where it wasn't nothing, in vivid, specific, exhausting detail. Seneca wrote something almost startling on this exact point, that we suffer more often in imagination than in reality, and that a huge share of human suffering isn't caused by what actually happens to us, but by what we rehearse happening, over and over, for free, before it ever does or doesn't. This connects to something well documented in psychology, the mind's negativity bias, our tendency to weigh potential threats and losses far more heavily than potential gains or neutral outcomes, a bias that likely helped keep our ancestors alive around real predators, but now runs constantly on imagined ones, a difficult email, a doctor's appointment, a conversation that hasn't happened yet. Here's the reframe, and it's the important one. You're not being responsible by pre-living the worst version of Thursday 14 times before Thursday arrives. You're paying the emotional cost of 14 bad Thursdays and getting at most one real one, and most of the time not even that one, because most of what we rehearse never happens the way we rehearsed it. The action today is direct. The next time you catch yourself simulating a bad future in detail, say out loud if you have to, "This hasn't happened," and redirect that energy toward the one version of Thursday that's actually real, the one where you haven't lived it yet. There's a harder version of this leak worth naming because it doesn't just cost energy, it costs relationships. When you've pre-lived a hard conversation 14 times, you don't walk into the real one open. You walk in armored, already defensive, already half arguing with a version of the other person that exists only in your head, not the actual person standing in front of you. They can feel that, even if they can't name it. So this leak doesn't just drain you before Thursday arrives, it changes how Thursday actually goes, because you show up to it already exhausted, already braced, already fighting a ghost instead of a person. Think about how differently a fight would go for a fighter who spent the week dreading it, compared to one who simply walks in clear. Musashi's whole approach argues that a fighter exhausted by anticipation is already half defeated before a blade is drawn, while a fighter who arrives with nothing pre-spent has access to the entirety of what he's actually capable of. Most people don't lose Thursday's hard conversation because they were unprepared. They lose it because they arrive with nothing left, having already spent their best version of themselves 14 times on a conversation that only ever needed to happen once. And here is the backfire I promised you at the very beginning. The thing that ties every single one of these leaks together, and is going to sound like a contradiction until you sit with it for a second. Almost everyone who feels chronically tired responds by trying to add something: more caffeine, more willpower, more motivation, more hours of sleep they don't actually have room for, more hacks, more supplements, more hustle to push through the exhaustion instead of understanding it. And every single one of those additions makes the underlying problem worse, because none of them touch the leak. You can drink 3 more coffees and still lose energy to the grudge you haven't closed, the decisions you haven't automated, the spotlight you're still performing for, the attention you're still fracturing across 4 tabs, the future you're still pre-living in your head. Musashi's whole approach to combat was never about generating more force. A duel isn't won by the fighter who swings hardest, or most often it's won by the one who has the least wasted motion between seeing the opening and taking it. Every twitch of hesitation, every unnecessary adjustment, every ounce of tension carried in from a fight that already happened, that's energy the opponent gets to use against you because you spent it on nothing. The paradox is this: the way to have more energy is not to generate more, it's to stop leaking what you already have. Trying harder to power through tiredness while the leaks stay open is like bailing water out of a boat with a hole in it and wondering why you're always exhausted and always still sinking. The hole was never about how fast you could bail. And this is where it gets almost uncomfortable to admit, because it means the industry built entirely around fixing your tiredness. The energy drinks, the productivity apps that ping you every 20 minutes, the influencers selling 5 a.m. routines as the answer is, for most people, selling you more force instead of less friction. None of it is necessarily useless, but none of it touches the actual hole in the boat. You can optimize your morning routine down to the minute and still hand away half your energy by 9 a.m. to a decision you didn't need to make, a grudge you didn't need to replay, and an audience that was never really watching. Force was never the missing ingredient. Attention to the leak was. This is why so many people feel like they've tried everything. They have everything except this. They've tried harder mornings, stricter diets, better supplements, longer sleep windows, and each one produced a small, temporary bump before the same fog rolled back in a week later. That's not a personal failure. It's the predictable result of treating a leak like it's a shortage. You cannot out-supplement a decision you keep redeciding 40 times a day. You cannot out-sleep a grudge that's still open. The fix was never upstream, in more fuel. It was always downstream, in the friction. Picture the version of you 6 months from now who has actually done this, who has quietly patched the leaks instead of buying more energy in a cup. You wake up and the first 10 minutes belong to you, not your phone, not the 40 small decisions waiting to ambush you. You get dressed in 90 seconds because you already decided what ordinary days look like weeks ago, once, permanently. You walk into that hard meeting and you say the imperfect version of the idea instead of the forced, rehearsed version, because you've stopped performing for a spotlight that was never really on you. You have one task open at a time, and when you finish it, you actually feel finished, not that low hum of half attention still pulling somewhere else. You think about Thursday's hard conversation exactly once, clearly, and then you let Thursday be Thursday. You still get tired, that never disappears, and it shouldn't, because rest is supposed to follow real effort. But it's a clean tired, the kind that comes from a full day of actually living, not from 40 invisible cuts you never noticed you were bleeding from. You notice it first in small, almost forgettable moments. You answer your kid's question in full sentences again because you actually have something left at 6 in the evening. You sit through a boring meeting without your leg bouncing, without checking the time every 90 seconds, because you're not simultaneously managing 3 other unfinished things in the background. You go to bed and you actually fall asleep instead of lying there rerunning a conversation from Tuesday that doesn't need rerunning anymore because you already closed that file. Your friends notice something before you do. They'll say you seem lighter, more present, like you're actually in the room instead of half somewhere else. You'll shrug because from the inside it doesn't feel dramatic. It just feels like having enough finally for the people and the moments that were always supposed to get the best of you instead of whatever was left over. You still have bad days. You still get cut off in traffic, still get the email that ruins your morning, still lie awake occasionally with something on your mind. This isn't a permanent immunity from being human, but the bad days stop compounding into bad weeks because you've built the habit of closing the loop instead of leaving it open. The decision made once, the grudge filed as closed, the attention given fully to one thing at a time. You spend less time recovering from your own mind and more time actually living the life the recovering was supposed to be protecting. The world doesn't get calmer. Your inbox doesn't get shorter. People don't stop being difficult. Mornings don't stop being rushed. The future doesn't stop being uncertain. What changes is that none of it cost you what it used to cost you because you've stopped paying for things that were never actually happening. For the next 7 days, I want you to run one experiment and only one. Pick a single day and track every place your energy leaked before noon. The decisions you over-deliberated, the grudge you replayed, the performance you put on, the attention you fractured, the future you pre-lived. Just notice it. Don't fix all 5 at once. Musashi didn't win 60 duels by trying to master everything simultaneously either. He mastered one form of economy at a time, in one context at a time, until it became automatic and only then moved to the next. Pick your worst leak. You probably already know which one it is. You knew before I even finished describing it, and give that one your full attention for the next 7 days. Let the other 4 wait their turn. You don't need more energy. You've never needed more energy. You need fewer leaks. That's the whole method. Underneath everything else this video has said, not more force, less friction. Not more hours, fewer wasted motions. Not a louder push through the tiredness, but a quieter, more deliberate account of where it's actually going. Comment the word closed below if you're doing this 7-day tracking challenge starting tomorrow. It helps me know exactly how many of you are actually applying this instead of just watching it, and it'll put you in front of the follow-up video where we go deeper into each leak one at a time. If this reframed how you think about your own exhaustion, subscribe, because this channel exists to keep handing you old, quiet weapons for a loud, exhausting world. Thank you for staying to the end. Cut once.